Chapter 23 Founder's Keep. Astari Castillo. Astari Castillo leaned on the railing. She was so tired, she couldn't think anymore. She had not been to Founder's Keep since her graduation many years ago, and had only been to the top of the tower once in her life, and that was about a childish dispute with another mage. Astari quickly checked herself to make certain her tightly braided bun was still in place, and then unclasped the silver circlet that kept her silk turquoise blue and red cloak from interlocking the yin and yang symbol on the back. Astari took in a deep breath, and she looked out at the narrow window down at the 8-pointed star fortress below. Every wing of the star represented a different guild. The only mixed guild was Dragonhall, while they accepted anyone. The other 7 were exclusive to mages only. While all mages were encouraged to be well-rounded, eventually, after their second year, the apprentices were encouraged to specialize in one of the 8 disciplines. Astari had chosen to specialize in elemental magic. When she had chosen to be an elemental mage, she had thought of how exciting it would be to go out in the field and out on clandestine missions for the military. To be an elemental meant you had to be a quick and powerful caster. Astari was quite good with fire. She wasn't good as Magi Hendrix. That mage could singe the wings off a flying gnat before it could even think of biting him. To set something on fire meant she had to bring the heat from somewhere else. The horrid memory of having to rush an overzealous first-year apprentice to Mender's Hall after he had caught hypothermia and blackened his hands with frostbite was one that she wouldn't ever forget. Somehow, the Menders had managed to heal him in time without any loss of limbs or life. Magic was quite dangerous for those who didn't know what they were doing. Elemental magic was even more so. It was like running across a tightrope and juggling flaming swords at the same time. Astari set her gaze toward the winding staircase before her as she struggled to regain her breath. "How much further?" she asked. A deep, gruff voice rumbled from behind her. 33 more floors, Magi." Astari glanced at her sword companion. 2 intensely calm gray eyes gazed back up at her. The hulking figure wasn't even the slightest winded, and he was in a heavy black cloak and full polished plate armor, with his helmet tucked under his arm. Inside his helmet was her folded mage's cloak. Astari hated herself for her choice in footwear. She was half tempted to go barefoot and pass her thick, heavy-soled boots over to her sword companion as well. But still, she had some pride left in her. Founder's Keep, after all, was only 88 stories high. That was, of course, not counting the base level in the library. She didn't know how many levels those were. Only the head librarian knew that. Or at least, thought they did. "You're not tired," she remarked. An amused, wolfish grin fleered across his chiseled face. "Care to carry me?" Astari asked. "Certainly," he agreed. Astari quickly hopped up several flights of stairs and swatted away the large, powerful black gloved hand that grasped at her. "I will not be seen being carried over your shoulder like some sack of potatoes," Astari snapped at him. That was the problem with Darren. He always took things too literally. Or at least, perhaps, that was his way of driving her crazy. Sometimes she couldn't tell. "This does not seem to be the place to be fooling around," he grunted. Astari could have slapped him, but she was quite certain that the only one that would have been injured and felt bad after would be her. The very thought of striking that granite jaw made her fingers sting all over. She was pretty sure whatever blade that had left that small cut on his chin had shattered into a million pieces. "You're right, it isn't," she agreed, and turned around. 32, boomed a deep, gravelly voice from below. "Stop that!" Astari snapped at him. She paused. He grinned back at her. And no smiling. A thick, heavy black glove neatly washed away the grin, leaving deadly serious and disturbingly insidious deadpan stare. Astari whipped her head around and then glanced back. Those stern, hungry, gray, wolf-like eyes followed her. "Are you coming or not?" she called down to him. She could sense he was, merely taking his God's damn time, as it was clear she was not at all in a good mood. Nevertheless, she was glad for his company. She had given him permission to stay and grieve, but he would not leave her, and she wondered if he was regretting his decision. This had been Astari's first and true taste of combat, but for Darren, this had been simply another day. Darren liked fighting. Before coming to Glenton, he was an experienced, battle-hardened infantryman from Falmar province. While many newly graduated field mages were in a rush to pick their sword companions from the recruits down in the sparring yards adjacent to Founder's Keep, Astari had found Darren in town while he was on leave. Darren had made quite the name for himself in the local tournaments, and she had to duel 3 other mages and tell off nearly the whole bloody army to keep him. Darren hadn't been keen on giving up his command either, but Astari could be quite compelling and persuasive when she wanted to be. Now clearly wasn't one of those times. Strangely, with all the death and carnage, Darren's mood had improved, while hers had taken a turn for the worse. She was tired, and she wanted to curl up in a ball and cry until those horrible images, sights and smells and screams would go away. Thankfully, Darren had been with her. He had been a shield against the arrows of the enemy, both physically and metaphorically. His words of encouragement and direction aided her in scattering the hordes that sought to overrun their little seaside fortress. So many dead. So many awful screams. She could still smell the awful, oily, sickening sweet, charred odor. But it wasn't in her mind. That odor still lingered in her hair and on her skin. It tainted her clothes and saturated her bedsheets and pillow and made the bathwater smell like rancid pork. Finally, she had reached the 87th floor. She could tell because she remembered the waiting area in front of the 2 large, heavy, oak wooden doors. When she had to report to the overseer that one time, many years ago, after dueling the other 3 mages. Thankfully, no one had been killed or maimed, but it wasn't at all for the lack of trying on their part. The one drawback with weather magic and casting lightning was that it wasn't fast as elemental magic and required a lot of concentration. And it was hard to concentrate when your dress was on fire. But she hadn't been in trouble for that. No, it was for beating the mender over the bottom with her own staff and smashing the telepath's head into the wall that had earned her the tongue-lashing. Luckily, she was an army field mage, and so bad behavior wasn't entirely discouraged. and thankfully things were smoothed over with a lengthy apology letter. Astari had actually never seen the very top floor, but the 87th floor was close enough. As overseer, Lady Sybil's private living quarters resided on the next level up. Supposedly, the reasoning for the 88th floor was a symbolic one. Why the overseer consented to be exiled on the top floor was another question altogether. Perhaps it was some sort of tradition that the overseer was showing some sort of humility, as typically the ground floors were more expensive and desired. Astari speculated that might change if there was some sort of contraption that was invented to shuttle them up and down. There were some hoists typically used with block and tackle devices for mining and loading cargo ships, but she really doubted the crusty old mages in charge would ever consent to remove some of the beautiful marble tiles and ancient text in the middle of the floor to indulge in laziness, and no longer read the sacred prayers and meditations inscribed in every bloody step that had been left behind by the founders century ago. Astari had heard some say this was to discourage the overseer from overly micromanaging her fellow mages down below, making it so she would only come down for very important reasons. Likewise, the heads of each of the 8 halls would have to have a bloody good reason to come and bother her. The awesome view from the balcony was tarnished as she watched the sun glisten off the narrow river of polished black coffins flowing out of the city. The weather didn't seem at all appropriate. The singing birds outside the window didn't share her grief as her haunted, dark brown eyes stared down at the city below. She wished she could smite Noon himself for being so insensitive to their nation's plight. Or perhaps the sun god was merely oblivious to the human ants crawling about on the big world. Or worse, the gods were so involved they found some kind of twisted pleasure in watching them suffer. Astari felt so helpless as she watched the slow funeral march work its way out of the city. She wished she could be there to support what remained of her soldiers and fellow field mages, and to help bring their fallen out of the ruined hellscape of the burnt-up Glendon city, and finally set them to rest on the soft, rolling, grassy hills that overlooked the ocean. Astari turned away. Part of her envied the dead. They were to be laid to rest in the sacred grove, reserved only for those brave who had died in combat. Instead, she was here, standing in her black funeral dress, waiting to be invited for an urgent meeting with the overseer. As she waited outside, she wished Darren would say something, but he didn't. There was just silence and the singing songbirds until finally the large oak doors were opened and she was beckoned into the overseer's office. Lady Sybil's narrow, obsidian black eyes cut away from the mountain of letters on her desk, and she tiredly glanced up toward Astari. Behind the overseer stood her guardian. Although he wasn't tall, he was well-proportioned in every way. Not a stitch or hair was out of place. The side of his head was clean-shaven and cut short in a clean fade. His bronze-scaled armor was polished so well it had a near golden mirror finish. Not a thing was out of place anywhere. Despite his youthful, almost boyish clean face, he had high, near-cut-like cheekbones, and his narrow, pitch-black eyes could cut through glass. Astari felt as she might faint, but a firm hand steadied her, and she quickly regained her bearing. She approached the table, exceedingly glad to know Darren was with her. He had said nothing for hours, But she didn't blame him. She had insisted that he go grieve for his family, but he would not leave her. His hulking shadow eclipsed her own, and his wolf-like grey eyes gazed ahead. "Magi, Astari, I am deeply aggrieved to hear the terrible losses that you suffered. Glendon City and all the mages at Founder's Keep are in debt to you," Sybil acknowledged. Astari gave a grim nod, but that was all she could muster. She was by no means the leader of Glendon army, but after suffering so many losses, she was one of the few mages remaining, and the one selected to report back to the overseer, while her brothers and sisters buried the rest of their dead and picked through the charred debris and combed through the streets and surf for whatever they could find that was left from the missing. Lady Sybil continued. "Falmar province, down south, on the borderlands, was hit hard as well. I suspect the Drun thought we would be forced to overcompensate our forces to one side or the other. Yet we remain." Astari forced herself to smile. "Yes," she agreed. Her eyes turned toward the blackened plumes of smoke and haze coming from the once vibrant, beautiful city. "General Mataris has requested aid, and he is asking for volunteers to help in Falmar province." Astari turned, her dark brown eyes brimming with tears, and her hands coiled into determined fists. "I accept. I will go," she declared. Lady Sybil gave a quiet but reverent nod of appreciation, but the silence that followed set Astari off guard. The seconds that went by seemed to take hours, until finally Sybil spoke again. "I have no one to spare," she declared. Astari frowned. She didn't understand. "But," she began, but Sybil held her hand up, insisting that she be permitted to explain without interruption. "You will go, but not to Falmar province. I need you and your sword companion to seek out potential mage apprentices and some more hot-tempered young warriors that can be trained as soon as possible. Your mission is to find them and bring them back for training," she instructed. Astari felt her face burn as if she had been slapped. "You're sending me away! Can't you find anyone else?" she demanded. Sybil smiled, a dark, secret smile, and she shook her head. "No," she responded in a cool, calm, tranquil voice. "I need 100 more mages like you." Then she gestured toward the hulking, silent shadow behind her. "And guardians like him, to keep our new mages like you alive," she added. Astari shook her head. "Yes, but you don't need me to do it. Why not pick one of the librarians or a green mage?" she insisted. Lady Sybil's obsidian black eyes sparkled with dark amusement as she prepared to unveil the secret that she had been keeping back. "Because you personally will be leading those men and women into battle." She paused. She waited for the young field mage's reaction. Astari felt as if her knees might buckle. She had never been in any large leadership role before, nothing at all like Sybil was suggesting. Typically, one field mage was put in charge of a small platoon of 50 soldiers, not an army. I'm only a field mage," she stammered. "Then get ready." Astari shut her mouth and forced herself to give a quick bow of her head. Sybil's sharp black eyes pivoted and then shot up toward Darren. "I want the meanest and toughest sons of Maltine in all of Marne. Find them, recruit them, buy them, blackmail or steal them, but bring them back, she commanded. Darren grinned a big toothy grin. It will be done, head overseer, he vowed. Lady Sybil nodded. Good. Make it so, she commanded, and she dismissed them with a wave of her pen. Chapter 24. The Overseer. Once they had left, Melrick, her sword companion, quietly stepped around in front of Sybil's desk. While he said nothing, his presence radiated with power and energy that she could not ignore. The Overseer set down her pen and waited expectantly for what Melrick had to say. The head senior cadre, Whitmer, has fallen ill, he announced, but he did not elaborate any further. This always annoyed Sybil. He spoke so little, and when he did speak, he never explained himself, and always left her guessing as to what he was implying, which sometimes felt very much like extracting teeth. Thank you. I will go visit him after I'm finished this letter, she assured him. But just as she was about to dab her quill in the ink well, Melrick spoke up again. He isn't as spry as he used to be, Melrick added. Sybil arched her thin brow. I suppose you wish to take his place, she inquired pointedly. No, even if it were given to me, I would not accept. I was merely making an observation. Whether or not Cadre Whitmer retires or not, I predict we will have to find someone to fill the void, he clarified. Very well. And if I ordered you to step in, Sybil ventured. I would refuse, Melrick insisted. Sybil's amused little smile fell. This did not happen. Nobody told her no, and certainly not her sword companion. You are my sword companion. You cannot refuse, she warned sternly. After tomorrow I will have served for 8 years, Melrick replied. Sybil leaned back in her chair and studied her sword companion for a long, hard moment. He had never complained, never mentioned that he was unhappy or desired to leave before. Theoretically, the ethical thing for a mage was to give their bonded sword companion a chance of freedom after they had served their 8 years. Theoretically, anyway. Theoretically and ethically, mages were not supposed to soul bond soldiers against their will, and while it was frowned upon, it was not unheard of either. We are at war. I cannot spare you. I will not release you, and you will do as you are commanded, Sybil replied flatly, and went back to trying to read her letters. But she was so flustered and hurt she could barely see straight. I will not, Melrick insisted. Sybil slammed her quill down onto her desk. I can have you executed, she threatened, but Melrick merely smirked. You could kill me here and now, he shrugged, and then turned, began quietly walking toward the door. Sybil folded her arms and glowered at Melrick. She waited. She could see he was deliberately walking slow. She wouldn't give in. She would call his bluff. Melrick's black leather-gloved hand turned the door handle, and he opened the door. Melrick, stay! Sybil commanded. This was a direct command that was not only spoken, but also invoked through the soul bond. Melrick could continue walking, but he would be compelled to return. Whether it was today or tomorrow, one way or the other, he would have to return. Very few could fight this compulsion while they were awake, but the power that bound them would eventually overtake them the moment they fell asleep, assuming they didn't lock themselves inside or tie themselves up to a tree. to keep themselves from sleepwalking back. There were some horrible stories of soul-bonded men or women walking off cliffs to escape their cruel masters. Well, Sybil wasn't the easiest person to work for or get along with. The last thing she needed was such a horrible story pinned to her reputation. Mallory turned and folded his arms. "You can compel me to stay, but you cannot compel me to train the recruits," he declared confidently. "Shut the door," she commanded. Mallory neatly closed the door with his foot and glanced back toward Sybil. "Are you truly unhappy?" she asked, but he did not respond. She tried to feel through the soul bond, but he would not let her in. "I am not releasing you," she insisted. An amused smile formed on Malric's lips. Sybil bristled. "What's so funny?" she demanded. But, as before, he would not grace her with an answer. "I command you to speak!" "The majority of our recruits are incompetent fools. I will only instruct them unless I am given full authority and control over their training, no matter how unorthodox or grueling," Malric insisted. "Very well. Granted. Anything else?" she inquired. But somehow she already knew she wasn't going to like whatever came next. "I also want full autonomy. Neither you or your silly tarts from Menders are permitted to intervene with the sword companions or subvert my authority," he added. Sybil's ebony black eyes narrowed. "This is Founder's Keep. This is a mage guild, and you and those sweaty recruits have sworn to serve. You do not command any of us. If another mage tells you to do something, you are obligated to do it, and that goes for all recruits here. Do you understand me, Malric?" she snapped at him. "How many mages did you lose last night?" Malric demanded. Sybil felt a knot twist in her stomach, and she looked toward the mountain of letters. Each one represented family members that she had to notify. It had been far too many. "If you grant me this, you will not be disappointed," Malric insisted. Sybil swallowed hard. She could tell this was going to go down like a sack of rotten potatoes with the rest of the 7 guilds, especially with Menders Hall. Menders were naturally prone to coddling. They were healers, after all, and they were always too eager to go running into the sparring yards to intervene over every bruise and scraped knee. She knew what Malric wanted. Malric wanted the authority to tell them off and to mind their own goddamned business. This, of course, was a lot easier said than done. There would be trouble, and she would have to deal with it. "All right," she whispered. When she turned, she was startled to find Malric standing right beside her. "Then I accept," Malric said. His voice was a deep, strong, powerful whisper as he cupped her cheek. Sybil's eyelashes fluttered as she felt his warm lips press against hers. Her lacquered fingernails grasped at his shoulders, glided along the shimmering bronze metal-scaled armor. "You had better make this up to me," she murmured. Chapter 25. Nora Frey. Progress. Nora Frey smiled up at the gold-trimmed maroon silk canopy above her. It had been the best sleep since. She let out a withering sigh as she remembered Vila. She hoped he would be back soon, but not too soon. She had a lot to get done. The last thing she wanted was him coming back to a burnt-up hut in the middle of a courtyard. She quickly pushed the thought out of her mind. She didn't want her sword companion to sense her worrying. He wouldn't know what it was exactly, but she didn't want him to worry about her. If he worried, she would worry about him worrying about her, and that would not do. There was a knock at the door. "Breakfast," a maid announced. Nora beamed happily as she burst out of bed and investigated the full spread of fresh, steaming, hot-swirled cinnamon bread, strawberry preserve on toast, eggs, and bacon, and a side of oatmeal. Howbeit, unlike Nadette's bland, salted gruel, this oatmeal had sugar and apple slices in it, and it tasted like absolute, supreme victory. Once she was dressed, she was startled to find Staff Sergeant Monty waiting for her outside the guest house with a large group of workers. "Good morning, Magi." "Good morning, Staff Sergeant," she greeted him back. Monty's chest swelled. "We are ready when you are. Just say what you need, and if we can't do it, we'll find someone who can make it happen," he declared. "First, I need a goat, and then I need a pool to be dug inside the barn, and a hot water spring to be redirected," she announced. Staff Sergeant Monty saluted. "I will find someone who knows how to do that," he assured her. Within hours, Nora was back at her own estate. The snow was removed, and the courtyard was sanded. By midday, men with pickaxes had cleared away the frozen ground, and trenches were dug to lay the pipe and divert the hot mineral springs. Howbeit this time, instead of changing, Nora strolled into the mansion with her full, gilded green uniform and flowing silk maroon turquoise cloak. Naturally, she had made certain to carry her staff as well. This was going to be a hard lesson, but she was going to make certain Winter understood she wasn't food. Nora tisked at the horrible lime-colored walls. She couldn't wait to have it renovated. As she approached the bathhouse, the goat began to struggle against the lead. Nora gave it a quick kick in the rump that sent it scurrying forward. Obviously sensing the danger, the goat turned about. A ball of fire blossomed on top of her staff, and she hurled it forward. The goat bolted into the opposite direction of the crackling yellow flames that scorched the floor. Winter's head emerged from the cloud of steam and snatched up the goat and began thrashing its still bleeding body about until it went limp, broken, and lifeless, and then he commenced ripping it to pieces. Nora was pleasantly surprised to find that the blood was quickly washed away. The mineral pool had a continuous flow that cleaned itself as it allowed fresh water in. Well, sort of. Nora was going to have to clean it anyway. There was dragon filth everywhere. It didn't smell as bad as it sounded. It just dried out and left a strong musty odor that wasn't suitable for civilized human dwelling, or hygienic for her dragon. Once the goat was gone, Winter quickly fixed her big black obsidian eyes onto her. "No," she said, in a firm but soft voice. She already knew what the dragon was thinking, but she was surprised by its reaction as Winter quickly dipped her head down and backed away from the edge of the pool. Nora wasn't used to dealing with dragons that were this responsive or intelligent. Part of her felt a little bad for treating Winter so roughly in the beginning. "What am I going to do with you?" Nora cooed softly. The chandeliers had been moved. She had a sneaking suspicion that they would be at the bottom of the green mineral water. "You certainly have expensive taste," she remarked. Winter's head dipped lower until all that could be seen were her two big nostrils. Nora smiled as she held up a glass sphere out to the light. The sphere sparkled with silver dust and tiny, swirling blue ribbons. Winter's nostrils vanished between the steaming green murk. Clearly not at all willing to socialize with her or give up any of her precious crystal hoard. Nora smiled as she quietly set the dragon charm down at the edge of the pool and then walked away. While she didn't hear anything, before she rounded the bend, she glanced back. The sphere was gone. This was certainly enough for today. After eating such a large meal, Winter would only be interested in curling up and taking a long nap. Further training would have to wait until tomorrow morning. There was no need to rush things, she told herself, but it was hard not to get overly excited as Winter, at least in some ways, was already leaps and bounds of most dragons when it came to socializing with the new rider. Every day for the next 7 days, Nora returned and placed another glass sphere at the edge of the dragon's pool. However, on the blessed 8th day, Nora was pleasantly surprised to find Winter waiting at the entry for her. "So nice to meet your acquaintance," Nora cooed softly. Winter tilted her head and pushed a crumpled candlestick holder with her front paw. Nora arched her auburn brow and braced her hands on her hips. "Is that really a fair trade? It's broken and tarnished from mineral water," she remarked as she held out a bright red dragon charm. The frost dragon glanced down at the candlestick holder and then let out a rumbling, flustered growl. Nora smiled as she backed away and opened the large double doors. But instead of following, Winter began to retreat back toward the dining hall. "If you stay in that mineral bath all day, your scales will rot off," Nora called after her. She doubted it really would, but she had to try something to coax the dragon out of her house sometime. Winter blinked and cocked her head to the side. Nora could tell by the dragon's body language the hendrake didn't understand what she was saying, but she had its attention. Right then, Nora wished she had Simmons' gift of telepathy. She wondered what was going through Winter's mind. She would have killed to see even a fraction of what was happening. This technically was possible through a soul bond, but Nora didn't feel quite ready for that quite yet. She wanted to form more trust first. Soul bonds were quite dangerous, and she had more than herself to think about. Nora sighed. "Suit yourself," she shrugged as she pocketed the dragon charm and walked back out toward the courtyard. The sound of large talons clacking against the floor put a grin to her face. She didn't look back, but instead she calmly walked over to the newly remodeled barn. She held her breath as she walked inside. Nora wasn't entirely sure what the dragon would actually do. The dragon could turn right back around, just take off if she wanted, but Winter had been so fixated on her and so chatty that she felt safe with taking the risk. When she turned around, she wasn't at all disappointed. Winter was merely 20 paces away, craning her long neck up and investigating all the new sights and smells. Nora held up the shimmering red glass orb. Winter let out an exciting chirping sound. Nora grinned and tossed the charm into the brand-new, steaming hot mineral pool. It was 3 times bigger than the one inside the bathhouse. In an instant, there was a loud splash. Nora smiled contentedly. She was drenched head to toe, but she didn't care one bit. She had finally gotten her house back. Step by soggy step, she glanced back and paused. Winter still happily threshed the warm water with her wings and bobbed her long neck up and down as she dived and darted from one side of the pool to the other. Nora smiled again and then shut the barn door. Winter seemed so happy. She doubted that she even needed to lock her in. She just wasn't ready to let her go flying about free range quite yet. Nora was pretty sure that wouldn't be a problem so long as she quickly moved all the wrecked bits of chandelier and charms into the barn. The last thing she wanted was for Winter to try to move back into her newly refurbished mansion. Just when she turned around, she was confronted with a tall, well-groomed young man with slicked black hair and long gray overcoat, with a white scarf and a gentleman's small travel sword fixed to his belt and a sea bag in his arms. James, what a surprise! It was true. For a moment, she didn't even recognize the butler. "I'm going to Glendon," he declared with a big grin. "I see that. Are you going to be gone long?" she asked. James shook his head. "Oh, no, it won't be long. It's just for a small holiday," he assured her. Nora smiled. "I'm glad to hear it. I was worried I was going to lose you forever after hearing about the news in Glendon." James shook his head. "I only heard what happened down south, but I hadn't heard much from Glendon. What happened?" he asked. "They were hit hard as well. I was told it was only a diversionary attack from their main push down in Volmar." James's shoulders drooped. "Well, I suppose it might be a bad time to go altogether," he sighed disappointedly. "Perhaps I will just visit Tackroon instead. I hear the weather is nice in Tackroon," he mused. Nora gave a sympathetic nod. "Oh, Tackroon is absolutely charming. You'll love it. It's so green, and everyone is really friendly," she encouraged. James brightened up a little. "I suppose Gojen is just next door, too. That might be a sight to see as well," he added. Nora smiled, but she held her finger in warning. "Watch out for the food. It's a bit spicy," she advised. "I will, Magi," he promised. "And James, come back safely, and don't do anything foolish," Nora pleaded. A bright white smile flashed across his face. "I won't. Besides, someone has to guard the library," he teased. Nora smiled back. "Well, I'm glad to hear it. I've been losing good people left and right as everyone is rushing to join the army or rebuild in Glendon after the fires," she said with a sigh of relief. "Oh no, this is just a personal holiday," he assured her. Nora nodded her head with approval. "I'm very relieved. I dreaded what you might do if you heard what happened to the great library and founders. I'm so glad you're not running off to join the army." The color drained from his face. "The great library? Was it burned?" he asked. Nora shook her head. "Well, not entirely. Just a few small fires, but they were put out and some books were stolen. But the library itself is fine, and all but for a few of the culprits were caught," she assured him. "Stolen? Books were stolen?" James gasped. Nora shook her head. "It's not as bad as it sounds. The librarians are always losing books, and the library is so huge, you could be lost in it for weeks. When I was an apprentice, we had to go on a search for one of the elder mages who had been missing for several days. But when we found him, he was fine, and still had plenty of food and candles, and was rather quite surprised to see us," she chuckled. But, we gotta get all the books back, right?" James asked. "Oh, it's not that big of a deal. I'm sure they don't even know what books were actually stolen. But if they did, I'm sure there would be a hefty bounty on them. But there is so much going on. Nobody really cares about a few books," she assured him. "I care." "James, they're just books. You shouldn't get so worked up about such things. They could simply be encyclopedias or something else silly," she insisted. But the young man had turned and began hurrying off in the other direction. James, wait! Please come back! James, where are you going? She called after him. I'm going to Glendon to find those books, he declared. Nora hurried after him. But James, you don't even know what they are. I'll figure that out when I get there, and then I'll find them. Nobody steals books that aren't important, James insisted. But James, that will be dangerous, Nora gasped. James grit his teeth. I know, he agreed, but he did not slow his determined march toward the gate. James, Nora called. The young man glanced back. Nora smiled. Have fun? James hesitated. He glanced down toward the mountain, toward the city, and the ships coming and going, and then back toward Nora, and then back toward the ocean. His right hand tightened around his bag. His left gently secured the bronze pommel of his sword, and with one big gulping breath, he began his journey down the mountain. Nora watched as he went, but as she wondered if she had done the right thing, she became aware of a little old woman sitting quietly on a large boulder on the side of the road. It was Nadette. Luckily, the old woman was still busy gazing toward the city down below. Nora smiled at the guards, and as quietly and nonchalantly as she could, she quickly hurried away from the gate. Perhaps she could pretend to not have seen her. She smiled. She was quite confident that the guards wouldn't know the old hag or let her in either. At least they had better not. Chapter 26. A Friendly Duel. My name is Marco, and I am the author, narrator, and glee man for Founders Keep. I wrote this during the lockdowns, and it is an audiobook for free on my YouTube channel at Dragon Audiobooks. If you want to read along, and if you absolutely love the book, you can get the hard copy, and you can get it in digital. The cool thing about this book is that you can share it with your friends, and you know J.R. Tolkien. Would you like to write him? You can't. He's gone. J.K. Rowling. You probably could messenger. She's a busy lady. She might get back to you. But me, I am here to entertain you. I am not just a writer. I am a glee man, if you will. And I do podcasts. I do audiobooks. So not only will you get this audiobook, you'll get all the other stuff that I put out on YouTube. And the most important thing, a sword. The most important thing, there will be dragons. There'll be lots of dragons. And most fantasy books, dragons have gone extinct and they're gone. These dragons are very much here and real. So there will be dragons. So Founders Keep, fancy fiction, magic, mages, swords, true love, revenge, Dragon Audiobooks. Follow me on Twitter, Dragon Audiobooks, YouTube.